This is the GARIS book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is Chapter 2, Part 4 of my book entitled Multis and Monos. What the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. This is Part 4 of Chapter 2 entitled Countries, Pros and Cons. So just continue on from Part 3. This section called Clean, on the pros of Japan, clean, safe and efficient. When I was living in Europe from 1971 to 1991, every time I went to or passed through Switzerland, I was always struck by its cleanliness relative to other European countries. Switzerland runs neck and neck with Japan as the world's richest country in terms of GNP per capita, using exchange rate comparisons, not PPP, purchasing power parity. And it is well known that there is a correlation between high standards of living and cleanliness. But having now lived five years in Japan, that would be in 1997, and having been to Switzerland in 1994 and 1995, thanks to the EPFL, École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, in Lausanne, I was struck how dirty Switzerland seemed after Japan. Japan is incredibly clean. The Japanese people care about the tidiness of their country and do not throw away papers to the same extent as in other countries. The Japanese are a very clean people, period, taking more care of their appearance than any other culture I'm familiar with, which is about 20-odd altogether. Japan is safe. The crime statistics in Japan are well below Western levels. I believe this is a consequence of the high cultural homogeneity. For example, whenever I go to the US, I feel insecure. There's a real lack of solidarity in the US. The US is a mongrel culture, an immigrant culture, with people from many different countries, different religions, customs, etc. In such a country, it's not surprising that there's very little collective group feeling. How can you have much in common with, and hence sympathy for, the guy next door when he speaks a different language, worships a different god, has a different skin color, and sees the world totally differently from you? The net result of all this is that the US, in my view, is a deeply socially self-alienated culture, an uncaring culture, and this leads to crime. The US also has a blind spot about its gun control customs, so that it's easy for US citizens to buy guns, including and especially for criminals. In many countries, including Japan, it's illegal to have guns, the argument being that you don't give razor blades to children. Ad-libbing now, I've completely done a U-turn on that attitude. I now see the fact that there are more guns in America than Americans as a good thing, because that fact alone will stop the hated Jewish banksters from taking over America and destroying it. Because if they try to do that, the Jewish banksters, they'll be murdered. They'll just be shot dead by Americans. So it's a heavy price to pay, because Americans have about 30,000 gun deaths a year because of their guns. But that's the price to be paid to keep America free from the hated Jewish banksters. The net result is that the US has more gun murders in a single city in a week than whole European countries have in a year. In contrast, Japan is far safer. It's culturally homogeneous, so people understand each other and hence feel a far greater degree of solidarity. You can walk the streets at night and feel safe, even if you're a young, pretty woman. America, with all its propaganda of being the land of liberty, cannot even supply its citizens with the most fundamental of individual liberties, that is, the freedom of personal safety. Japan doesn't have to worry about this. I do hope that when world TV comes, with 1,000 channels coming out of the sky from all countries, that the US will feel the wrath and contempt of the majority of countries against its incredibly stupid gun laws, and that the US will change them. Living, that was obviously before I learned from the internet about the Illuminati, the aim of the Jewish banksters, Rothschilds, Morgans. I need food. Japan is efficient. As an example of this, consider the train system. Japan is an extremely high-density population country, so it's economic to have a railway system that goes everywhere. For the first 6 months at my lab, I had a car, but I never used it. It was more convenient to take the train and not have to worry about the hassle of finding a parking place, a major hassle in a very crowded country. And I can read in the train. In Japan, or at least in the region I live in, that is Kansai, Kansai, which is West Japan, near Kyoto, the trains run at different speeds, that is limited express, express, semi-express, and stop at all stations. And they all run on the same tracks most of the time. For a faster train to overtake a slower one, the slower one has to pull into a station on one platform and wait for the faster train behind it to pass via another platform. To enable such a system to function, trains have to be on time literally to the minute. I know of no other country that could do this. It's very impressive. In Japan, virtually all the machines work. When I go to the US or Europe and I have to use a public phone or a slot machine to buy something, far too often it'll be out of order. In Japan, maintenance is excellent. Better still, the machines themselves are better made. Japanese-built cars run for decades due to the greater care the Japanese workers take with fine details and quality control. This aspect of Japan I am truly proud of, as are most Japanese, I suppose. I observe and listen in to Japanese tourists visiting the West, expressing their frustration and disdain at the inferior level of organization in Western countries. I find myself developing similar attitudes the longer I live in Japan. Gambare, which means, that's Japanese, it means persistence. One of the psychological characteristics of the Japanese I admire the most is what they call gambare, G-A-M-B-A-R-E, which means perseverance, persistence, sticking at it. This quality is deeply ingrained in the Japanese mind and explains a lot of Japan's financial and economic success. I suspect that gambare evolved as an important social value in Japan due to several factors. I should state right here that I'm hypothesizing. These are only my own opinions. Gambare is needed, I believe, to learn the Japanese writing system, which is so tedious and clumsy that it takes enormous persistence to master the damn thing. Since all Japanese school children go through this mental torture, it's not surprising that the teachers foster the gambare value. It's a psychological prerequisite for learning the writing system. Another factor, I suspect, comes from the vulnerability of the Japanese people to natural disasters, earthquakes, typhoons, fires, giant earthquake-induced waves called tsunamis, etc. Tsunami, by the way, is a Japanese word. Japan's geographical position, that is, it lies over a part of the tectonic subduction zone of the Pacific Plate, makes the country vulnerable to these calamities. Since nothing can be done about them, gambare is a useful quality for the Japanese to possess. But when a population has gambare, it can be very useful for economic success. When the population, well, the male half, works really hard and for long hours, GNP goes up. I suspect the major reason why Japan has been such an economic success this past century has been due to gambare. I really admire this quality because it requires guts, discipline and energy. The Japanese have this in abundance. Other cultures which lack it do less well in terms of pushing up their material standard of living. Mind you, gambare alone is not enough to create a well-functioning society. It's pointless being persistent with a given task if the task itself is misguided. Sometimes it's more intelligent to abandon a task which is hopeless than to persist with it. Gambare and good judgment are two different things. Wa, that is, politeness and harmony. I love the politeness of the Japanese. There's a highly developed standard of behavior towards others in Japan. One of the country's strongest values is wa, that's W-A, that is, the preservation of social harmony in a densely overcrowded nation. Wa means not annoying your neighbours or work colleagues. Children are taught from a very early age to get on with their peers in a group context. I think I understand now the need for this value in Japan. When you look at the size of traditional Japan's personal houses, their rabbit hutches, you begin to appreciate the need for keeping a tight lid on the expression of personal negative feelings towards others. Japan cannot afford the personal freedom of expression when 3 generations live in 50 square meters or less, as has been the case for many centuries. Japan is the size of California, with 80% of the land useless for farming or housing because it's too mountainous, too steep. So a population half the size of America is squeezed into the remaining 20%. Japan also insists on growing its own rice, not trusting its overseas neighbours to do it for them, see below. So land is even more squeezed. Land prices are the most expensive in the world, and it's only recently that earthquake-proof technology has been developed to build higher-rise apartment blocks, thus creating more living space by building vertically instead of horizontally. So for centuries, the Japanese have lived squashed together with no real privacy. The standards of public behaviour which have developed over the centuries to cope with this basic population density make it very difficult to criticise anyone or to say no to anyone. The Japanese are extremely conscious of not offending each other. The result is that Japanese grow up with vulnerable egos by Western standards. This politeness is very nice to live with on a day-to-day basis, but for an intellectual like me, it has its disadvantages as well. See below. The Japanese may not like foreigners, but at least on the surface they don't show it, unlike many other countries. So living here as a foreigner is at least tolerable in that respect. Literacy rate. Japan has one of, if not the, highest literary rates in the world, about 99%. The primary schools are very effective at teaching the 3 R's to the young students, with the result that Japan scores as one of the world's highest in international educational competitions. The Japanese education system, with its ganbare value and discipline, drills its young students very effectively to master the basics. Admittedly, creativity suffers, but at least the students can read, write, and thus later in life can understand the technical manual to operate a VCR. Remember, I wrote this 20 years ago. Most young people don't even know what a VCR stands for. It's a video cassette recorder. Back to the book. This is superior to many other modern countries such as America, which fails to teach 10% or more of its young students even to read. Japanese are ad-libbing. You need to admit that about 10% of American population are blacks. Blacks have an average IQ of 85. It's a full 15 IQ points lower than the whites, a full standard deviation. So some of the 10% of the American figure is due to genetic reasons, just genetic black inferiority, IQ inferiority. In black Africa, the average IQ, that's 1 billion people, the average IQ is 70. 10% or more of its young students even to read. Japanese are understandably proud of their educational record, at least at primary school level. This pride is reinforced when the Japanese see other countries copying the Japanese primary school educational methods, as is happening a lot lately. However, at higher levels there are problems. For a criticism of secondary and tertiary education in Japan, see below. Health and longevity. When I arrived in Japan, I had a European body, based on eating Western foods. Now I'm 10 kilos lighter. I eat mostly a Japanese diet because I'm convinced it is superior and healthier. It's interesting watching recently arrived overweight Americans slim down after a few months of working at my lab, where they eat a Japanese diet in Japanese quantities. The Japanese are the longest living people on the planet. If the men didn't smoke, 60% of them do, the life expectancies would be even better. When I'm in the US and see all those all-you-can-eat restaurants and a ton of what I call FFRs, fast fat restaurants, I'm disgusted because it's largely these restaurants that have made Americans an obese people. I was recently in Tsukuba, Japan's first science city, which is the most Americanized city in Japan. There were many American-style FFRs and all-you-can-eaters. I observed the young Japanese who frequented these places and saw that they were as porcine as their American counterparts, and for the same reason, that is, a Western fat-based diet and simple overeating, even if the diet is healthy. I hope that a social consciousness will arise in the West which stresses the importance of restaurants serving healthy foods and that they present them in responsible quantities. For example, if a person has a certain height, then he should eat a given number of calories per meal. Meal sizes could be arranged into categories. For people with heights 150 to 160 centimetres, 160 to 170 centimetres, etc. Customers could then buy the recommended meal, which is not only dietetically sound, but whose quantity is also. Serving reasonably sized quantities of food is done automatically in Japanese restaurants, but in America, restaurants offer their customers as much as possible for the cheapest price. The result is that the US food industry is indirectly killing Americans by generating obesity and lowering US international competitiveness, because 2/3 of Americans are carrying around excess fat, which reduces their dynamism. Americans have become fat and lazy, whereas Japanese are still lean and mean. Unfortunately, US fast fat restaurants, FFRs, are impacting badly on Japanese youth, with the usual consequences: junk food turning into junk bodies. Arts. Japan has a highly developed artistic life, including such art forms as No, N-O-H, which is a slow, story-based dancing with masks and guttural chanting. Bunraku, B-U-N-R-A-K-U, life-size, handheld puppet dolls. Kabuki, that's colourful popular character acting. Bonsai, that's miniature trees. The martial arts, many of them. Temple gardens, etc. The list is long. Japan is an ancient nation and has had plenty of time to develop its art forms. Any Westerner staying in Japan for at least a few months becomes aware of the richness of Japan's artistic tradition, unlike the New World countries, which are largely parasitic on the Old World for its arts. In the US, when I listen to public radio, all I hear is European classical music. America is a middle-browed culture because the European upper class did not want to migrate to a primitive frontier country, which would have lowered their quality of life. Europe's lower and middle classes did migrate to the US, bringing their middle-browed tastes with them. The New World countries are basically a bunch of Philistines in that respect. I know, I've lived in 2 of them, and in 4 from the Old World. Temple gardens. I have a strong love of beautiful things, such as classical music, which can literally bring me to tears. I play the piano. Natural settings, and since I've been in Japan, I have discovered the beauty of Kyoto's temple gardens. Each time I enter them, I feel this aspect of Japan is distinctly superior to the West. I remember having had a similar feeling the first day and evening I arrived in London, after having definitively left Australia, my first country. In brackets, Australia is a phlegmatic, anti-intellectual country, a brawn as opposed to brain, sport-oriented culture, derived historically from the British lower class, with all the lower class distrust of the upper class and upper class intellectualism. I felt my passionate intellectual values were not valued, so I had to get out. In the 19th century grandeur of London, when it knew it was number one, I felt I was in a superior culture. I was also profoundly impressed by the intelligence of the debate on BBC TV I saw that first evening, which gave me a feeling of coming home, even though the culture was new to me. This deep emotional experience taught me a lesson. That is, it's possible to upgrade your quality of life by simply emigrating and absorbing the superior features of the new culture into your own personality. I've done this almost routinely now, having lived in 6 countries, although I think I'm getting too old to change again. But I did. I moved to China. And so far as the time of making this recording, I've lived 11 years in China. But I'll probably leave in about a year because, like with Japan, I'm fed up with China. When I see the Kyoto Temple Gardens, I see a whole philosophy, a view of the world that Westerners usually don't see. It's terribly moving, for me at least, so I sit and sit, absorbing the beauty and the mentalities of the Japanese Buddhist priests who built these jewels of serenity and visual harmony. Sitting in a temple garden, I feel a real pride. This is one thing at least that the Japanese do superbly well, and I'm glad to be associated with a culture that can produce such beauty. I'll have to put more photos of these gardens on my website to show what I mean. Slim. I'm writing this section after a month's trip to Europe and the US. What hits me each time I go to the US, and hits me again when I return to Japan, is the fatness of the Americans and the slimness of the Japanese. I believe that the obesity problem in the US is becoming an epidemic. The overweightness of the average American keeps rising year by year. Since I see the US in quantum jumps, it's easier for me as a foreigner to see the gradual trend than for a monocultured American, for whom the changes are too slow on a day-to-day basis to be noticeable. I believe that the fatness problem is sufficient cause to explain America's decreasing international competitiveness over the past few decades. The fatness problem drains Americans' national energy. When one is carrying around an extra 5 or 10 or 20 pounds in excess fat all day, it inevitably takes its toll. The average American has less energy to do his/her job well due to fatigue, particularly towards the end of the day. Japanese, on the other hand, are much slimmer, much closer to the ideal, healthy weight for one's height. This gives the Japanese an extra competitiveness, allowing them to put more energy into their work, rather than into lugging overweight bodies around. The Americans really have something to learn from the Japanese in this respect. It's easy for me to see why Americans are so fat. It may sound facile to say, but it's true nevertheless, that Americans eat too much, and what they eat is often too fatty. The average American diet is way too fatty. Japanese diet is a lot healthier, which is why most of the time I prefer to eat Japanese style. My body is the better for it. When I first came to Japan, I weighed 82 kilograms for a height of 177 centimeters. In American, that would be 5'10", I think. I now weigh 73 kilograms, due largely to a Japanese diet and a greater consciousness of the importance of being slim and the need to exercise, which I do for 10 minutes each week morning when I'm not traveling. When I travel, which is pretty often, say 4 to 5 times a year, my routine is broken and I don't exercise. This often means that if I'm in the US, I'll put on weight, due partly to the lack of exercise and partly to American food and its quantity. This last trip I came back 2 kilograms over, which I lost again within 2 weeks. When I'm overweight, I feel bloated, heavy, and lack energy. Of course, some of this feeling is due to jet lag, but some of the excess weight as well. Why is America getting so fat, and what can Americans learn from Japan in this regard? One thing that really shocks Japanese when they go to the US for the first time is the size of the servings at an average American restaurant. It's often literally double what they would expect in Japan. Why double? I suppose because a vicious circle has been established over the decades. Many Americans have become overweight or obese and have become accustomed to large servings, so restaurants, which compete amongst each other for customer patronage, are motivated to give their customers what they want, that is, large servings. The larger the servings, the greater the fatness. The greater the fatness, the greater the desire becomes for large servings. How did this vicious circle get started? I suspect it's because America was the first country to become truly affluent. Food in the US is of high quality, abundant and cheap. It's easy to buy lots of tasty food in the US. It takes a continuous act of willpower not to overeat when in America. Americans have the highest average purchasing power of any nation, so more Americans eat out at restaurants than in most other countries. Given the size of the servings and their quality, it's easy to overeat. And since going to restaurants is a regular and frequent activity for Americans, it's not surprising they put on the pounds. The other factor, of course, junk food and fast fat restaurants. The traditional American diet is distinctly unhealthy, meat-based, fat-based, a veritable disaster. I'd like to see more Asian-type fast food restaurants set up in the US. Here's an opportunity for enterprising Asian Americans to save the US from obesity by serving low-fat, high-nutrition meals and in proper quantities, with size labels such as standard, extra, large, aka slim, fat, obese. There needs to be a greater awareness of the damage that being overweight does to people's health. Being obese can shorten one's life expectancy by a decade or more. It's a major mass killer. A feeling of well-being presupposes being slim. Unfortunately, American restaurants are invading Japan more than vice versa, with the same negative effects on young Japanese bodies as in the US. It would be better if Japan sets up chains of fast food restaurants in Japan and in the US to counter these negative effects. Young Japanese are increasingly developing the same obese junk bodies as their American counterparts. This is tragic and angers me. I consider this kind of thing as an American pollution. It's not conscious, of course, because the Americans are suffering more from its negative effects than the Japanese, but the Japanese are now starting to suffer in a major way too. The attractive Japanese slimness is beginning to be fattened out American style. I notice that when I'm in the US, I find less than 10% of American women sexually attractive to look at, due to the fact that most of them are overweight, a real turn-off for me, whereas Japanese women I find much more attractive due to their slimness, and because of the slimness, they don't have the pasty faces of American women, and American men too. I consider Japanese slimness one of Japan's major points of attraction, when compared with the repulsiveness of American obesity. Japan should be exporting its dietary habits, because on this point, Japanese practice is distinctly superior. And I'm saying this as a Westerner. It's just a fact. Con. Most insular. If someone were to ask me, what aspect of the Japanese annoys you the most? I would answer immediately, their profound insularity, their extremely poor sense of cultural relativity, their inability to put themselves into the shoes of a non-Japanese, their intercultural incompetence. Each culture has its weaknesses and blind spots. If you asked me the same question about the Americans, based on my 6-month single stretch living in the US in 1989, I then went in zeros in the 2000s. I lived 5 years in the US. Based on my 6-month single stretch living in the US in